start things off, I guess I wanted to say thank you for everyone to being part of this and for agreeing to have these conversations. Give us your time and your energy and your insights. It's really important, and really admire each of you individually. So very grateful. I'm Frida. We all know each other in some way, shape or form from the world that we inhabit together, which is of course that of jazz. And I've been behind the stage for all of my career. I've been working on producing things, working in the London Jazz Festival, working with artists both in the UK and increasingly in the US, Robert Glasper, Christian Scott, and all people that have, I think, really important things to say, because that's something that I find important in my work. I want to be working with people who are making a stand and using their voices to enact change. So recently, I think my partner, my colleague, Rachel, and I founded Arts Allies as a way to help develop the conversation about privilege and race and whiteness amongst white people, a way to develop our allyship. And on the back of that, We Out Here invited us to have a conversation about allyship in jazz, at which point I reached out to all of you, and here we are. So if you all just want to give us a kind of quick hello, tell us what you do, and then we can jump in.
Cool. My name's Soweto Kinch, jazz musician, MC, and activist. I've been engaged in both a mixture of touring and organising community events such as the Flyover Show, festivals such as that for about 20 years now already. Gosh, time flies when you're having fun. And I found this moment of lockdown really interesting, challenging on a number of fronts. Obviously, the cancellation of work, focusing in on the whole story of the murder of George Floyd and Edward Colston, etc. But it's forced a level of introspection that I've really welcomed. So one thing I can say right off the bat is that while some of the things that we talk about might be uncomfortable, it feels really a cathartic moment. We can share things amongst each other that have probably been brewing in the back of our minds for decades, so this is, I think, about facades being pulled down, certain canards being disproved and moving forward in solidarity.
My name is Shabaka Hutchings. I play in various groups, mainly Sons of Kemet, The Comet Is Coming, and Shabaka and the Ancestors. Again, thank you for having me. For me, it's an important topic because it's a topic that constantly gets reinvented. It's like the question of race for me is the question of identity and how you identify with the other as well as yourself. And as we know, like, at least for my life, the way that I identify with myself today is not the same way that I did 5 years or even 2 weeks ago. So it's a constant process of redefinition, and actually not necessarily in a singular way, because you're identifying with other people and with other people's impressions of themselves and yourself. So it's, like, these conversations it's great that they've kind of started in a public way in the wake of the George Floyd tragedy and the subsequent protests from that. But for me, it's this, process that needed to have happened and needs to keep happening. My wish is that actually we have these kind of talks and they just continue to be updated, and actually structurally within the industry, there is some kind of mechanism to make sure that voices continue to be heard in a way that's inclusive and, enlightening, because there's always stuff for us to think about and new perspectives to take into account when thinking of what races and what racial issues are going to occur.
My name is Jyoty. Thank you for having me as well. I'm actually truly humbled because I think I'm coming into this conversation as the baby in many aspects when it comes to and activism, but also jazz. I'll definitely gonna, as a DJ and a radio host and a curator, come from the world of intersectionality in every sense of the word, also sound-wise, genre-wise. I think, to agree with you, Shabaka, everything that's happening now is very necessary, but it needs to be ever-changing for it to make sense, because we can't keep having these conversations as reactions to certain things happening around us that channel some sort of interest or accountability. It needs to continue as an action, so maybe we can avoid, which is impossible, but maybe to a lesser degree, this panic that then becomes all consuming and also very often leads to misinformation and misguiding. So, if we can have this as a constant, everlasting, constructive, and ever changing conversation, then I think it could be very fruitful for people who live in this world, who consume it, and who love it, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, is the way that recently we've had all these kind of conversations burst forth. Circumstantially, I think people have had a lot more time to sit with the most recently publicized tragedy. It's not the only one, it's not been the only one, but I think the fact that we've had this time of reflection has really meant that it hit home in a way that it hasn't before. But I think it's also almost paralyzed some people because there's been such an incredibly emotional response to it. And I think it shows how infrequently we have those conversations, and actually how unhelpful it is to be in the midst of a lot of emotion, because this isn't, whilst it is an emotional subject, this is a structural situation. And really, in order to do the work, we need to address it and confront it and kind of make it something that is logical and rational and functional rather than just reactive, which is really what we kind of, I'm hoping that we can start to do. And as I said, I think it's so important that white people really take on that responsibility, take on the responsibility of having conversations frequently and as part of the norm to address where they are and what they're doing and how they feed in. And that applies to everything from their personal life to their professional life. And they can harness a lot of power. We can harness a lot of power as essentially the privileged part of this system. And therefore we have a lot of responsibility to react to it. And I think as someone that works in jazz, but has worked in it for a long time, I wasn't always aware of that power or that responsibility, or, to my kind of shame, the context. I started working in a world that was inherently Black without necessarily respecting the responsibility that conferred upon me. And, because I was just pursuing something I loved, and, I felt myself to be a kind of person that was in a good place, but that's not enough. It's not enough to do that. There's much more work to be done. And I just wanted to start with a statement that Yvette Griffiths from Jazz Refreshed gave me when I was talking to her about what we're doing here in this conversation. And I think it highlights, how endemic a kind of inequality still is in our world. And if I just read that, and then we can, I think, jump off from it. She sent me this statement: Jazz Refreshed exists because of the prejudice and elitism that existed in jazz and still does in many ways. 17 years ago, we created a night where artists who had a more culturally diverse expression of jazz could have a platform at a time when all prominent venue gatekeepers were white and restricting the artistic cultural expression on their stages. In addition, we wanted to create a space where people of color felt welcomed as an audience and comfortable to attend and appreciate the music. We actively promoted the events to those communities in a way that wasn't happening at the time by venue gatekeepers. The result was high diversity ratio in audiences. During Jazz Refreshed life, right up to this moment, as an organization, we have faced racial biases. Some may have been unconscious, but some were very conscious. There were organizations within the industry who were unhelpful and some condescending. It was not an easy journey for Jazz Refreshed, but we persevered with our goal to create a space for the breadth of cultural expression within jazz. The Arts Council funding, though woefully inadequate to support our vision, was the turning point for the organisation that made others pay more attention, allowed us to stabilise and expand our output, and seemed to give us a respectability that made others suddenly want to engage. All of that is to say that the industry still has a long way to go. What is brilliant is artists representing the scene right now, many supported and elevated by our own platforms. They are acutely aware and vocal within and outside of their music about the cultural disparity here in the UK and around the world that has existed for eons. They are using their uniquely Black British perspective, which didn't really have a notable voice on a global stage until recently. The Shabakas, Cassies, Camillas, Zaras, etc. are incorporating related histories into their musical narratives And the Oscar Jeromes, Sarah Tandys, etc., are being vocal about their allyship during this very important time. We will continue to be the change that we want to see and fight for behind the scenes for fairness, redressing cultural barriers and imbalances. And I think for me, reading that, it's a real reminder of the struggle and how real it is and how continued it is. And I know that each of you can probably speak to that in terms of your own experiences, your own journeys. You know, this is not, whilst you inhabit positions of prominence now and you are success stories, I think it's far too easy to imagine that that means that there isn't an issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, like if we get down to the nitty gritty and just kind of cut straight to the chase of something that actually kind of splinters off into, you know, a much bigger issue, I think there's an issue in that on a societal level, there's a belief that Western culture is better than African culture, you know, and that can splinter off into the situations that happen when people go to music school, in music college, you know, the similarities in what people have to put up with in terms of condescending remarks, in terms of just real structural biases. I did a classical degree at Guildhall, you know, and there's so many things that I saw that were really biased against jazz and against the idea that jazz can be an equivalent art form, or you can have an equivalent technical proficiency to the classical idiom. And, you know, so for someone like me, that, you know, I could just see it for what it is. If you think classical music is better than jazz, you think that white people's, you know, white culture's music is of more importance than music of African descent. And where that ideology comes from is a place of white supremacy, whether it's acknowledged or whether it's even known by the people that are actually thinking it. It comes from a colonial relation to the music of the other. And that goes all the way to the arts institutions who get a lot more money for you know, like for opera, for instance, than other music, you know. And I feel like this is one of the core things, you know, within our scene to address, you know, like how do we value the elements of our culture that are subsidized or that are actually acknowledged by the system? You know, is it in an equal way? Is it in a way that reflects the society and the society's needs? Or is it in a way that is maintained by views of culture that are antiquated, but they just kind of continued because no one's actually questioned them? So I guess the first thing is like the money that goes to organizations. Yvette said, you know, Jazz Refresh recently got Arts Council funding, and that helped put it onto the map. But there's been so many years where, as a kind of prominent Black-led organization, they weren't getting any help from the government, whereby the government's giving money around left, right, and center to loads of people, just not them. I think this is one of the things that, you know, institutionally we can actually kind of look into. And, you know, I don't know what the answers are going to be in terms of how much money is distributed, but it's something that I've definitely felt that if you're going to look at structural inequality in the arts, you know, the kind of trail of money to subsidize the arts has to be seen as an overall, you know, as an overall idea, you know, in terms of who are the gatekeepers, who deem what music to be of more merit than others. And, you know, I think it's really great to just put names and faces to them and actually kind of, if it's public money, like put it all up to account. I think, you know, and that's just me, I might be a left-leaning hippie, but I think that we should have like real transparency in actually like how we are subsidizing culture, and what are the core values that we are doing that subsidy, that sustenance of culture with. And, you know, values are things, culture is something that's fluid. Values are something that's fluid in culture. So if we're going to be, for instance, maintaining certain art forms at the expense of others, then we need to constantly be looking at the ideals that go into the valuation of different cultures, you know, over others. And, you know, Britain is a place at the moment that has lots of cultural stuff happening. You know, some is funded, some is not. There's no moment better than the present to just always kind of upturn all of the assumptions that the system works. And that's something that I think British people have, I guess, they've ingested an idea that the system works, and or that the system works in the most part. recent events with Corona and the government's response to it has been one of those times where we can't help but know that the system doesn't work in that respect, in terms of a general government ineptness. But that ineptness goes way back, you know, on a structural level into all elements of society, if you look at it from a perspective of non-complicity with the narrative that everything is okay and everything is fine, and we don't need to look into, you know, if there are any unconscious biases within our organizations.
If I could interject, I think that slavery was called the old corruption for a very good reason, and I've often opined in this time when governments, ministers are getting dodgy contracts to deliver PPE that's inadequate. I kind of feel that the beginning of the revolving door, this sort of relationship of nefarious business dealings and practices that happen abroad, and yet a laundered reputation here at home, is something that's very seldom interrogated. And I'm really glad that you started by really trying to understand the origin of this. Having gone to Congo Square just a couple of years ago for the first time, and of course traveled across the diaspora, there's a sort of energy and simplicity to the way that African people express themselves around the diaspora. And the thing that's concurrent is that white people have often come on from the outside and are faced with a choice when they come into contact with indigenous culture, as you put it. You can either become part of the community and go native, as some Western explorers did, the minority, or you're the conquistador. And there is an obsession, I think, in the West with taxonomies of filing and putting things in a sort of order and understanding it. That means that you never have to invest yourself, your spirit, or see these human beings as equal. And so therefore people become experts in post-bop. They become the trad post-avant-garde, you know, professor, as opposed to somebody who's like Bix Beiderbecke, for example, who would have had to cross the train tracks to learn from Louis Armstrong, who would have had to make material sacrifices, if you like, to be part of that culture. And I think that dichotomy is something that would serve us well in the future. You're either making a commitment to be part of a community and to invest in it, your soul and everything, or you're doing it from the outside and trying to impose a system of control. If you like, following the conquistador analogy, going in, throwing Bibles at everyone and planting a flag of Spain in the soil, as opposed to, you know, recognizing that, particularly in the evolution of all diasporic forms of music across the African diaspora, there's a certain egalitarian principle where you have to sort of infuse yourself, all of your own ideas. You can't just sort of do it remotely. Yeah, and there's just so much that I find within the history of jazz that gives us the answers for where we might want to go in the future. A lot of this has been about the enjoyment of Black culture, Black verb, Black food, Black dance. This goes way back into the 19th century without Black people. How can we have all of that energy and verve that you do and sort of claim it for ourselves? Another key piece that I've noticed in the engagement with Black cultures historically is that every name that's been given to these genres is sort of derisive. Ragtime, something that U.B. Blake remarked on. You know, it's not something, they called their music art music or Negro music. They didn't call it ragtime. Jazz, sort of sexual, effluviant references, jazz. Rock and roll, again, sexual. Hip hop was a sort of slur, hippity hop, you jungle bunnies, spear chucking. And there's this long trajectory right up to grime and jungle that says there's a discomfort, but yet a fascination in viewing Black culture from the outside, as opposed to these are people making art that should be seen on an equal footing to Beethoven or Bach or Shakespeare. And as again, Shabaka rightly pointed out, there's this unspoken hierarchy of art that puts Western aesthetics at the top and everything else is sort of community art or native art or indigenous art or folk music, and it's sort of the poorer relation. I also find it fascinating that everything that we're experiencing with this coronavirus epidemic feels to me interleaved, inextricably linked to the murder of George Floyd. Let me put it correctly, the lynching of George Floyd. I don't think it's an accident that Brazil, America, and the UK, in terms of per capita infections, are still leading the world, even though they're trying to give us headlines about India every other day. We can all see the pattern emerging that there seems to be a causal link between white exceptionalism, we don't need masks, liberty, and all this sort of stuff, and infection rates. It's actually a deadly disease. And that would be an interesting way of sort of reframing this discussion, that whiteness is a pathology. It's certainly a psychosis, as a Professor Kehinde Andrews is writing about currently. And if we start to address it as such, then perhaps we can identify it in colleagues and colleagues that really could be put right, you know. And the other final thing I wanted to say is that this conversation never really moves on to reparative justice. It never really moves on to the economics of racism and slavery. It's always about quite superficial signifiers of allyship. We change a profile picture to a black square or say the right things publicly. But I think as Frida quite rightly pointed out in our conversation, previous broadcast, whiteness is very seldom, if ever, discussed amongst white people carrying forward. And the money, you know, it's that simple adage, follow the money. You know, we were still paying interest to slave masters until 2015. So for all the protestations about Wilberforce changing the dynamics of the country, follow the money. You know, do the musicians, the creators of this art, are they remunerated to the same extent as those funding bodies, as those facilitators, those people who see themselves as giving opportunities to disaffected black youth? There's a whole industry produces the jargon that's necessary to get the money to help the supposedly disaffected kids and black people, but do they actually get the money themselves? I think the conversation needs to be moved on to reparative justice.
I'm going to try to get my thoughts and say it in a way that makes sense, but I think what's really interesting about this conversation is that it's repetitive throughout the years, but also, I know we're speaking about jazz, but you see this, just as Soweto just mentioned, but with the names of all the genres, you see this across genres. And just to explain from my perspective, how I've experienced this, you know, I was born into hip hop. And then, you know, as a young kid, learned about soul and R&B, and then went back to blues, and then researched jazz and traced back everything to be the person that I am now with the taste in music that I have now. But something that I've seen over the decades and across these genres is that even within Black music and Black arts, the proximity to whiteness is what will see the most success, whether that's in support, financial. And I'm speaking as an Indian person, right, who has always had to, who's constantly learning on how to be the best ally, not just in spirit, but in action. And again, that is also money. I think where we see a lot of this injustice happening of, you know, consuming this culture and enjoying the culture, but not actually investing back into the culture, or using it as a marketing tool, but not actually giving without expecting anything in return other than enjoying the culture, it is because of, we can slowly break the cycle of having more Black artists being celebrated and their music and putting them on stages, but we don't seem to break the cycle of putting Black people in top positions within their own spaces that they should then be trickling down to create safe spaces that feel safe simply because they are created by their own people, you know? So there's this huge imbalance of, we like you and we like what you do, but you can't come over here where we actually call the shots and can then give you power and money and freedom and all these things that come with these high positions. And I think that's a conversation we also need to get into is, okay, why can we not see owners, promoters, bookers, agents, all these people who are just as important in this music industry, which then goes hand in hand with activism, which then goes hand in hand with seeing changes trickle down into society and what we consider to be normal. It starts at the top and behind closed doors. And I think that is a conversation to be had, again, also amongst non-Black people who are able to make a change behind these closed doors, you know, and not always expecting Black artists to do all the work and to tell I mean, how many more years of narrative do you need? I mean, I think we all know what's going on, and we do know where this music comes from. All these genres that Soweto has just mentioned, they're all genres that were born in oppression. They were all born out of struggle. So I feel like I'm kind of, I'm yet to turn 30 this month, and I'm already sick and tired of always having to hear people I love and respect and look up to so much having to explain what they need to see change. The truth is, let's just cut the bullshit. We know what needs to be changed. So why can't we ever just move forward to the actual practical points of what are we going to do to make these changes? I think everyone's just sick about the theory. The theory is there. If you've really been living under a rock and you don't know where this music comes from and what it is about, Google is your best friend. Really and truly, people don't need to tell you that anymore, because we can use people's voices and their time and their energy and their art for way more productive conversations.
You as well, Jyoty and Shabaka, but I'm just sick of being gaslit of this sort of obvious things happening in front of us, and we're like, is racism still real? Do you still experience problems with discrimination? Can we, as you said, Jyoty, can we have an honest conversation now, because we're past the gaslit, red flags to a ball here. I think we need to move on. I don't want to stop here.
No, I just wanted to say that I think I'm going to feed in from my experience as a white person with white friends and family who aren't necessarily as invested or immersed in, a diverse culture as I am. And the level of, I think, ignorance, obliviousness is still real. And, when I have said to the director of a jazz festival, you owe your career, your festival owes itself to Blackness. And they have paused and said, well, I don't know if that's fair. And to me, that's, kind of mind-blowing. To be fair, the person I was speaking to then also kind of reassessed and said, you know what, I think you're right. But it was like, this year I had this conversation.
I don't think that's ignorance or for want of education. I'll keep it brief. I think it's cognitive dissonance. Mm-hmm. I think profound problem. I was at the ABO once, about 3 years ago, where the Associated British Orchestras, they were discussing how can we get more diverse composers and orchestras. And to this day, I think Chineke Orchestra is the only fully black orchestra in the UK, always working. But the point is, people run to these repositories of whiteness to feel comfortable. As David Starkey was showing his entire buttocks the other day on social media, we were just like sat back, and I had to ask the question, how is this guy still been given a platform for 10 years, right? Well, the sort of fantasies that he peddles online and on kings, the history of English kings and stuff, speaking purely about history, is a fantasy that's attractive to a lot of people who feel that they can sort of escape the reality of Britain's diverse history, the reality of black and brown people that have always been here, frankly, and sort of hide in this enclave of whiteness. And that's what we need to call out. Mm-hmm. It's frankly, if I'm being crude, a masturbatory act of sort of surrounding yourselves with these emblems of, it's not that Shakespeare is a great writer, it's that you feel extra white when you're listening to it. And we need to start being honest, start calling that out. That's the reason why black culture is only viewed as in terms of novelty, in terms of, well, let's just get this new thing and then that will run out and pass its sell-by date. Whereas white cultures have a longer lineage and an inheritance, and we're still reproduced year on, year out.
I think one of the other things, just kind of chip in, to think about is actually the word culture. I think that there is a strange disconnect from actually what we call culture and what the potential of the word is. Normally when people refer to the word culture, especially in relation to black culture, they talk about entertainment. They talk about entertainment and fashion and kind of graphic design, stuff like that. Whereas culture that's not culture, that's one aspect of culture. That brings people together, but the culture is like the spirit of a group. It's the core ideology, the core, I guess, like, it's the core moving spirit that kind of takes a group, any kind of particular group, shows them what they're about. And that then is manifested in various other other elements within a society. When you're looking at Black culture, when it's reduced to just the offshoots of what the culture is, i.e. the entertainment, then it's easy to then just kind of pigeonhole and box in. And similarly, when you're talking about white culture, which is never defined, and if you just kind of refer to it as similarly entertainment, it's forgetting that if you're looking at the culture of whiteness in relation to history, it's a culture of having it's the practice of having a specific relationship to the other. It's a relationship to the rest of the world. And it's one thing to say, Great Britain had colonies, or Great Britain ruled the wave, or even the name Great Britain. It's one thing to say those two words, Great and Britain, but you have to remember that the culture that created that dynamic is the culture of oppression and a culture of exploitation, and any way of justifying it around and saying but this and but that is seeing it from a perspective of the conqueror. And like the main thing of, I think, the recent events is that the perspective of the non-conqueror is being taken into account, and this needs to, is the thing that needs to just be across the board, guarded into. Like there are different narratives. The one of the interesting things that I saw on social media with the defacement of the William Churchill statue, and said Winston Churchill is a racist. And lots of people are saying, no, he isn't. Yes, he is. They're saying, how could you say that? You don't know a lot about history. The thing that I always came back to is the fact that history is taught in such a way that people think there is right and there is wrong. They think in terms of absolute dualities, and that comes from a kind of culture of debate, whereby you win a debate or you lose a debate, and the winner is the person that's right, the loser is the person that is wrong. Whereas that's not how things go. There can be multiple realities. There can be different dimensions whereby both positionalities are right by way of what they see as the standards. By what the core values of the culture are. By the core values of British culture in terms of what Britain did to assume its superiority. William Churchill was a great leader. I can see how you would think that if you are looking from a perspective of white culture. But if you're looking from the perspective of Black culture, he was definitely not that. Similarly with jazz, if you're looking at jazz from the perspective of Black, a trajectory that starts in Africa and goes to the US and splinters off in various parts of the world in terms of a way of making music, a way of bringing music towards a central, communal act. Jazz has the music known as jazz has a very different feeling to it than if you're looking at that from a cultural lens of, I like something, therefore I can take from it. Because lots of people see jazz as that. You might ask many musicians who are non-Black, why do you play jazz? I like it. It's great music, and if it's universal. Music is universal. Whereas the kind of universalizing the particular is a specific aspect of white culture if you're looking at it from a historical point of view, in terms of how things have been taken from parts of the world that weren't white.
I think what you just said about the debate aspect, I think that's so important about, there's not necessarily always a right and a wrong and a winner or a loser. I think what we keep finding in all these discussions about, race and equality and what is fair and what isn't fair is this idea on the white man's side of everything being some sort of pie chart, like it runs out, like there's only this amount of rights, and if you get more then I lose mine, and there's only this much respect, so if I give you more respect then I lose mine, and we need to, and it all comes out of fear. It's this fear that then turns into the need of keeping control and ownership of something that was actually never owned by you to begin with. And I think that's this huge barrier that we have to break. And I think it starts with unlearning. Like we need to unlearn so much stuff that's been indoctrinated into all of us. Like, I mean, this is not just something into white people. I mean, this is also all of us who are non-whites have grown up. You know, I grew up in Amsterdam, I'm born and raised in Amsterdam, and I've spent years having to unlearn what I thought was the better way to be because of the books that I read and the cartoons that I watched and everything I learned in school. And I think that's something we need to do as a community, as entire nations and industries. We have to unlearn the way that we think that we can take from people, from cultures, from beings and spirits and ways of thinking and philosophies and identities.
You raise a really, can I interject?
No, please.
Raise a really powerful thing about resources, really, and the Eurocentric mindset that there's not enough to go around. And Professor Joy DeGruy, is a massive fan of, put this thought in my head that I've not been able to get out ever since. Why is Europe a continent? As you pointed out, we've all been indoctrinated into European exceptionalism. It's effectively, if you follow the rules of geography, a peninsula stuck on the end of Asia. But we forget heavy lifting, how much intellectual legwork is required to maintain Europe. And I'm not that interested in hearing self-flagellating conversations between white people saying, isn't that terrible, we need to do better. I'm more, and if I bring it up in terms of workshops and specifically teaching jazz students, it's about the music sounding good. I can't be responsible for how far you take your allyship once this class is done. But if you want to play jazz authentically, if you want to be an authentic MC, then I'll be able to hear if you don't respect the music, the people from whom you've gleaned this music. I'll be able to hear your discomforts, your insecurities, those elements of whiteness that you're holding on to, if you like, that you feel insulate you from having to be a full member of the community. And I think it's, again, a reframing of the debate to sort of start asking the question, well, why are we protecting white exceptionalism when, in fact, if we want to play this music authentically, if we want to represent this music authentically, then we need as wide as possible ways of representing everybody fairly within it.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing in that the idea of what it means to learn the music has been framed around institutions that are at their base anti-Black, in terms of how they view their proximity to Black culture, in terms of a line as opposed to a circle, a line in which one music is ahead of the other, as opposed to a circular construct whereby all musics are feeding into and away from a common source. You know, which, you know, for me, and I like this we're saying this because I am a Pan-Africanist, all music does stem from Africa because all people stem from Africa, so it just stands, you know, as a given. But I think that idea that you learn music from the academy, from the institution, means that you don't see music as anything but what is taught to you in a school. You know, if you're seeing music as a societal function, as something that if you learn it, you learn it in amongst being a part of the community that bore it, and how you are a part of that community is a question that constantly gets updated. It's not something where you go, I'm going to read how I become a part of the Black community, now I can be it. It's something that happens from experience, you know, and that's, I guess, the big, you know, and I'll talk about the academy all the time because I went to one, and it's, you know, it's a good microcosm in terms of how things happen in the external world. But if you're seeing music as a social force, you know, it needs to be more of you learn how to play the mechanics of the music, and therefore you are of it. You know, it does have deeper aspects to it. If you're looking at it from an African cultural perspective, even that, if you were to say it in an African cultural perspective in relation to jazz, a lot of people just don't know what you're talking about. They'll just think, okay, African, I guess, you know, I did an African course at some point. But there are ideas of what is African culture and what African values are in relation to music that need to be learnt. You know, and most of those ideas have to do with communalism and have to do with societal inclusion, and on a very core basis that I could explain, but not enough time. The circle as opposed to the line, the idea that we are all connected, and the idea is to find the points of connection, to find a way that we are related to what has happened before and what can happen in the future. If that's taken away from the music and it just becomes about you're better than someone that's done less practice than you, or you just managed to amass as much vocabulary from a certain idiom, as you can, then the music becomes basic and not deep, and for me, we're trying to find a way to get depth in what we do, get depth of perspective. And the only way to do it is to just really go in. Like, it's fine to say jazz was born of oppression, but do you actually understand what that means? For me, that's the question. Like, if you're gonna play music that is born, like, imagine if Jewish people were singing some songs in concentration camps that were really sad and expressed their profound suffering in that historical period, and then some people just started to like play that music and separate it from the suffering that bore it. It would be an outrage. I can't even conceptualize in my head that being done. Someone like Don Byron is the only person that I can think of that has taken on the kind of Jewish cultural forms of music, and he kind of really kind of goes into the historical implications of why he does it and his positionality as a Black man to that music. But you don't get the same thing when non-Black people play jazz music. You can play the music and it just becomes music that you like and therefore you take from, and that's for me one of the core things that needs to be addressed by people coming into proximity to this culture.
Also, the idea that you can have these compartmentalized distinctions between dance, music, visual art, religion, spirituality, all of these practices are sort of interleaved. And what we've been very successful at seeing in Europe is, through capitalism and through the taxonomies, as I described earlier, the way to sort of cleave these art forms from each other in a way that I think cultures right across the African diaspora wouldn't understand. Do you know what I mean? It's like, how can you have music without dancing? Well, there isn't a word for these distinct practices. How is your music not worship in some form? How are the ancestors not integrated into it? How is there not spirituality? And I do think that the Western anxieties around religion, for example, or maybe not being able to dance, are another way in which we're passing on insecurities and inaccuracies in the understanding of what jazz music is and what sort of place it occupies societally.
There's a really great phrase that I like to kind of remind myself of all the time by Dr. Marimba Ani, where she says, when you separate, how do I put this? When you separate the idea from experience, you get objectification. And that's something that stems back into European philosophical thought, back to Plato, in terms of the separation of the idea from the person. Once you separate that and you're regarding objects as separate to you, that is the essence of objectification, and it's the idea of the object being separate to you, as opposed to the communal, the circle where everything is connected on a certain level. The idea that there can be detachment from things, and the idea of just things like living beings or living forms that become concrete things and ideas that are kind of immobile throughout history is something that's very specific, that needs to be unlearned, that needs to be really kind of analyzed. This is why you can get people talking about jazz music within a framework of immobility. Jazz is this thing and it is not that. Why Jazz Refresh can be promoting Black music and someone can say it is not jazz. For me, that is objectifying the music of jazz as a historical artifact, when it's not. It's the reflection of a people's culture. And culture is something that is fluid, that constantly gets, that's a dynamic force.
I think what you are both discussing now actually reminds me of a conversation I was having with a good friend of mine in Amsterdam a couple of weeks ago. and this is not a statement I want to make. It just reminds me of this conversation, and I just want to bring it up because I think it'd be interesting to know how people feel about this. Our friend Gamte, who is manager of the likes of Carista, and who in the last few months has already had very interesting conversations about being a Black manager to a Black artist within electronic music. You know, he blew Theo Paris's mind when he saw him finding out that he looked after Carissa, because it's still so rare. Again, how does that make sense? But we could keep talking about that. But Gamte said, he said, Jyoty, think about it. You can't be Jewish unless, you know, your mother's side, etc. So you can't be Muslim unless prayer practicing. And we went through so many cultures, people who identify as being of a certain people. And then he goes, but if you think about Black people, he's like, what kind of rules or like regulations or entry process can you think of? And obviously we're all quiet at the table, and he goes, because there isn't none. He said, all I can remember growing up is you couldn't fake being real hip hop. You couldn't fake soul. You couldn't fake jazz. You couldn't fake all these cultures, which now comes back to what Shabaka was saying, is what we now define as often Black culture, which is forms of entertainment. He said those were the only things we kind of had as a rule book to see, are you really down or you're not? But now that is fading also when we look at the charts, when we look at who gets the most money, who graces the biggest stages, who do we like to consume these musical genres from and by, because we want it Black, but we don't want it too Black, you know? And I just, hearing you guys talk about literally everything you just said now takes me back to that conversation, because what are the norms? What are the rules? And how does one control this? And how do we move forward now, especially from this conversation, by saying, okay, what are the measures that we then keep of who makes jazz, and where does the intention lie, and how do we support it? Do we not support it? Who calls the shots?
Yeah, I don't have all the answers, but I'm thinking an analogy of food as you're describing it, that if I was just to create a bubbly wine at home and call it champagne, I'd have lawyers on me. I'd have, do you know what I mean? I'd have people on my case. Whereas Tom, Dick and Harry around the corner can make jerk chicken and call it such, and no one's going to intervene. There's no estate of jerk, you know, out there.
Yep.
And it's very much open season on black culture. I haven't got the answers for that, but I do think a lot of our problems again go back to this cognitive dissonance. It's that for all of these well-intentioned white people, I think they often just want to see themselves as Amanda or Sue or John or Steve, and they don't want to conceive of themselves as representatives of a race. And that paradigm is challenged every time you come into contact with Black jazz musicians or Black people. That paradigm is definitely, the cracks in that edifice are shown. And I think that's why we have every attempt possible, all the clandestine efforts that aren't publicized, the ones to get rid of Jazz Refreshed by nefarious means, the way that funding has been appointed to certain organizations and not to others. It's to remove that cognitive dissonance. And at its most dangerous and most violent, it does result in the death of Black people. There is this just discomfort every time we see you. So why don't we just not go to school with you, move away, just be in a different area? And still, when we see, we feel this discomfort, because it reminds us that the edifices of whiteness, the edifices of British culture specifically, have been built on exploitation and denying particular people their humanity. Specifically with the history that I'm discovering with race riots in 1919, and I'm starting to celebrate that and be inspired by it. It feels like we're being untaught about that. It's a conscious decision to keep these stories secret, that there was a Black population in Cardiff and Salford and Hull large enough to have race riots 100 years ago. And I don't think anyone needs to pass the missive around white people. No one needs to send a general email to say, right, we're going to just erase this from memory. It's that the shame is so profound, and there is a tacit understanding of what we do with shame, that it's just sort of shut those people out, pretend it never happened, they weren't here, and everything's fine, everything's okay. That's productive of mental illness, and it's certainly productive of playing bad jazz, and I think ultimately of a pandemic crisis, you know. But
yeah, I mean, if you
Sorry, can I just jump in? Because I think,
jump in.
Sorry, chaps. Just again, this, I was going to say bring it back to whiteness, which is kind of the antithesis of what I want to do. But I think it's so important that there's a few things that came up in, you know, what you're saying. Soweto talking about the being unlearned, like consciously not taught these things. I think that's incredibly important that we recognize that. And as we kind of, you know, talking before the recording, three of us have a background in history, and I'm speaking as someone who did an undergrad and 2 postgrads in history, and I studied in Bristol University, and we did a unit on slavery, and I don't think we read any text by anyone who wasn't white. You know, it was a very one-dimensional approach to this kind of history, and really it didn't address the statue of Colston, it didn't address the street names in Bristol, it didn't do anything reflective. And I got to my second master's before I really was learning in an educational institution about colonialism. And I just don't understand how that's kind of, I mean, I do understand. I understand exactly why that's the case, because colonialism remains benign when you remove it from the actual reality of the violence, the brutality, the harm that it has done, not just internally, but externally. And I think it's profoundly important that we verbalize the fact that these are massive omissions, and we don't talk about non-white history in the UK at all.
Just to interject, I'm fired up by this subject specifically. I feel that it's a form of witchcraft, a form of juju in a sense, because all of these cities that we go to, we strain our necks to look up at these villains, to look at these plinths of supposed great men of history and so forth. And every city I've been to recently, Cardiff specifically, Salford, Hull, had these dynamic black and brown populations that were the engines of their port cities' success. There would be no Cardiff without Tiger Bay, right? And when you go to Tiger Bay today, what you find is all these streets that were predominantly Arab, Chinese, and black sailors are in car parks. They're tucked behind the entrance to St. David's shopping centre. You wouldn't even know that there was a black community there before. And asking the local historians about it, and this all maps onto the music, there was a conscious effort to erase the evidence of where the wealth came from. And that's why I keep saying, follow the money. This is about reparative justice. I'll finish saying one story from Olude Equiano's book, and I read that whilst my history teachers were trying to ignore the details of slavery. I remember as a teenager reading Olude Equiano's book and the interesting narrative of the life of Gustavus Vassa. And 2 stories really leapt up out of the page at me. One I'll draw attention to is that he notices on the plantations that Africans had a small plot of land where they could cultivate herbs and spices. That was their own little tiny corner of the field. And they take these fields to these herbs and spices to market with the hope of selling just a few bushels of herbs every week to be able to buy their own freedom. And what the white patrons would do in market days, just sort of walk past them and pick up the herbs and just grab whatever they want and not pay a penny for them. And I get a lump in my throat describing it, because that and the killing of unarmed black people are like 2 cardinal sins that Olude Equiano draws attention to in 1770 something when he was writing this book. And there's an unbroken thread. We're not making herbs, we're making jazz records, we're making dances, we're making new crazes. And people just come up and snatch them and just take them. And this is a continual story. You could connect that to De La Soul saying they don't get any royalties for their 3 feet high and rising. You can connect it to every jazz musician I've ever known saying their record company sort of did. And
I think you have to then connect that to, you know, we've touched on intersectionality, but, you know, the context in which we exist, the neoliberal capitalist world that we inhabit, that informs how we consume, how we package, and how we, you know, disassociate. Like you said, you make objects of things instead of kind of recognizing the essential humanity of who we are and what we do and what we create and what it means to engage with that, not just consume it, you know, not just have it as a blanket of entertainment or something to kind of distract you for a moment. And I think it's so important that we constantly reference intersectionality, because when we talk about allyship and how we show up and how we really make that effective and potent, you know, understanding that these struggles fall in many ways, and on different people in different ways. And in order to kind of like be impactful, we need unity, we need solidarity, and we need to recognize that in each other, because you can't have effective, genuine, authentic allyship without solidarity and without intersectionality. And it's so important to always keep an eye on the multiplicity. You know, it's not easy, it's not simple, you know, but that's the point. And we have to discuss all those things repeatedly. And we also, just briefly to refer back to what you were saying about a conversation about what it means, you know, what popped up when you were talking about that conversation is how I'm never sat in a room with white people having a conversation about what it means to be white, ever, like ever. And those kind of exercises, I think, are important in terms of getting to a place of multiplicity and solidarity and intersectionality, because you start to understand yourself and reflect in and out, and it's like a zoom in and a zoom out to what is actually happening, what your role is, and understanding that, like you said, shame is so important. It's a societal thing. We avoid it. We avoid shame. And it's important that we don't, because there's guilt, there's shame, there's complicity. And that's, you know, it's been kind of inherited in many ways. But the way to, as any therapist will tell you, the way to navigate that is to confront it. You know, you have to confront it. You have to sit with it, exist in it, process it. And your point to mental health is so important as well. You know, I certainly felt in the last, you know, couple of months, there were moments when there was an intersection between my white privilege and my mental health that was really damaging to me and hurtful and harmful. And I had to kind of sit with it in order to get through it, in order to kind of continue the work that I'm doing, because ultimately the work is something that I can't not do. It, for me personally, but I think for everyone in reality, anyone who has a sense of humanity has to realize that you can't avoid it. Mm-hmm. But you might want to, because it hurts, and because it intersects with all these other things that kind of disconnect us, like that dissonance, like you said, cognitive dissonance is a way of avoidance, essentially. And confronting that is a painful and difficult thing to do. And pulling these strands and talking about this within every context that we're in, you know, we all exist in a music world, a creative world. And I think it's a really pertinent kind of forum for these conversations in multiple ways. You know, that, like you said, that we've been talking about the way that, you know, the consumer culture and the thread that it is, and the, you know, the context, the history, the legacy of Black music, Blackness in our world, whether we work in it and earn our, you know, pay our rent off the back of it, or we just consume it and kind of like feel good about it without really recognizing the kind of the entire context and, you know, complexity to it. It has an extra, I think, anyone involved in the arts or engaging with the arts has that kind of extra impetus to really go further down that path, because ultimately the imagination allows you to do that. It opens the doors to do that. It invokes that. And I think, you know, we're at an hour right now and we're just starting to scratch the surface. You know, there is no resolution right now. There's no per se, you know, there are actions that we can all do. They're personal, they're, you know, practical. And we want to we're going to put together a resource list of, you know, things to read and places to donate, and, you know, maybe template letters to connect with your employers about things that you can do, you know, if you want to continue this work in yourself and your own world. But I think also, like you said, the continued conversations, let's keep opening this up, keeping it a top priority and not letting it kind of fall down, because it's all of our responsibility to do that, and do that with the people that maybe haven't done all the studying, haven't done all the work, who are kind of like at step one, because that's a hard step to, you know, to make. And for me, that's something that I'm trying to kind of bear the responsibility for. But as we try and kind of like end this conversation, and if you could all just maybe have give us a kind of sentence or two as your thoughts, your kind of where you're leaving off, or where we're pointing to next, perhaps, because there is definitely no resolution at this point.
I think it's important to you know, what you just said is really important. I think it's really great to acknowledge that there is no resolution actually, you know, and put a full stop on the end of that. And then you say to yourself, and then what? You know, there isn't, you know, like for me, the significance of the kind of black circle, the black square on the Instagram kind of fad of everyone posted this black square. The significance of that is it gave the movement in terms of what it seemed like everyone was going up to in terms of everyone's consciousness in trying to at least proclaim an awareness of black issues. It gave it a focal point which it could then trickle away from, you know, and that for me was one of the big tragedies of the whole situation, in that it reached a conclusion with the black square. It reached a point where it could then start to fade away, where I think this is something that has been so ingrained in our society and in our the way that we define ourselves in relation to both black culture and white culture. But it can never end. There can never be a point when we go, okay, we've done our thinking about race. If you think that, you need to go deeper, and then you need to teach it to your kids, and then they need to go deeper, and then they need to think back about how you were complicit. Like, you know, like we are all complicit in the same structures because we are of Europe. So for instance, we'll be holding a mobile phone that has coltan, you know, that we know comes from child labor in the Congo. We'll be smoking, well, and I say we, but the proverbial we will be smoking marijuana that is grown by Vietnamese, you know, in effect slaves, you know, in our country right now. You know, these are, you know, and I'm not saying that they're equivalent to the black struggle historically, but the mind state that allows us to indulge in aspects of our society that we know are really shitty and still go along as if it's okay, are things that have happened in the past and that come from a way that we have ingested a view of reality from a historical European culture. And that view of reality is, if you want something, you take it. And once you have it, then how you got it doesn't matter, you know? And that's something that we need to look at in terms of our own lives and try to splinter off into as many directions as possible in terms of learning how people could sustain this system that has been so oppressive, and how we can then, you know, on individual levels and on societal levels, how we can then subvert it, how we can create other cultures or draw from other cultures in ways that are just better, you know, that are more wholesome and more, you know, progressive in terms of humanity, actual humanity.
Mm. Yeah, I'll jump in next. So a lot there to, you know, to decompress. And going back to the thing you were saying earlier about intersectionality as well, Frida, I think something that's often missing from that conversation is how power interleaves, how it interfaces with all of that. Again, something I've discovered in this research about race riots in Britain 100 years ago. In one case in Hull, and it wasn't an isolated example, black dockers were paid by trade unions to beat up Chinese sailors, Chinese workers, 100 years ago. Imagine that, minorities fighting amongst themselves. And it's embarrassing to read what, for example, West Indian Britons were saying about West African dock workers and Britons at the same time. We can at least eat with a knife and fork, said one missive. And you're like, okay, so we've internalized these ideas of power and this hierarchy of power. Historically, conversations about intersectionality and feminism have really, even the Pankhurst sisters sort of separate along those lines, where you've got Sylvia and Emmeline, one very much aligned to international solidarity, working class movements, and one very much wanting to have male white imperial swagger with a dress, right? So it's having access to the same nefarious systems of power, but in the skirt. That's not genuine feminism as I can conceive of it, or certainly not intersectional feminism. And I think the same things are there now that can produce a Priti Patel or a Sajid Javid, or whatever their equivalents are in America, where just performing position along some sort of imagined hierarchy, imagined pyramid, they're quite happy to sabotage their own brownness or own blackness for those perceived material gains. Finally, I just want us to conceive, as I said earlier, about whiteness as a psychosis, as a mental illness. If I had something that sort of made me act weird every time somebody had green hair, or like large shoulders, and I just called the police every time that happened, you'd quite rightly think I was nuts. And I think that's the level at which we should start maybe conceptualizing. It's not that easy, but to leave you with this thought that white exceptionalism in this context has been proven to be deadly. That's generally the way I see it. If nothing else will convince you of its harm, just look at how the coronavirus has been handled in, as you put it earlier, Frida, in this neoliberal, deregulated society. And I think you can't extricate racism from the economic system, and you can't vice versa extricate the economic system from its race-based system. When did Britain get its startup capital? 300 years ago, approximately. It really started to ascend with the Act of Union in Scotland. And I'll admit it, when the newscaster said, this is the worst recession in 300 years, even though I'm likely to be implicated in its effects, a little part of me had a chuckle, a sort of revanchist, like, because that was 300 years ago, was the time just before the South Sea bubble and all that, where Britain really got its slaving going, and if it means unraveling that entire system, that entire way of doing business, sign me up, because I genuinely think white exceptionalism, or the attachment to whiteness, is a killer in itself. Sorry, I haven't got anything nice. I can sing a song if you want.
Don't say sorry.
Don't say sorry. True that.
Do not say sorry.
I'm not really sorry.
I know you're not, and that's why sorry, not sorry. I guess I'll just end it with, there is no solution to the problem, but I think for people who listen to this conversation, who are part of bringing it back to the industry and to jazz and the world we all take part in, I would say check yourself. I do it regularly, all the time. My whole career is based off of, engaging and playing music that me nor my parents or my grandparents have actually lived, or stories that they per se have lived. So I do my very, very best, and I can always do better, to at least be actively giving back. And so I would just highly recommend, if you do take part in the UK jazz scene or the music industry, look around you. Does it look all right? Does it feel genuine? When you are alone at home at the end of your working day, or your gig, or your event, or you've closed your venue, or whatever, you go home, do you sincerely, when you're alone with yourself and your thoughts, can you say that what you're doing is fair? If not, work on it. You need to change. You need to make a change. Run people their money. Run people their money. Hire people. Hire kids. Not just, an unpaid internship or a work placement. No, it's time to actually change. And for people who are looking, don't be scared. Open your mouth. Now is the time. You see these kids, I'm not for cancel culture, but what I've learned during lockdown is we need to let go of what we think to be of correct platforms to exercise politics. Young people, they have this newfound fearlessness and energy and ways of getting their idea of justice however they want it, whenever they want it. And I think we, as slightly older people, can actually learn from that energy. And we have to we can't have our kids going out in these streets again and marching and all that shit. It's long. So I know there's, what I'm saying is not like the end all be all, but at least maybe some baby steps can be made here and there. And, we can kind of demand for some sort of changes in the way of what we perceive to be normal ways of handling.
Thank you so much. I think that was a really perfect kind of invocation to end with, because, like you said, this is not the end. It's not even the beginning. We're just stuck in the middle, and we've all just got ourselves and our own moral compass and our own responsibility to bear, and we got to show up. because we got to do better. And there are so many ways to do that. And it's not easy. It's work. It's work and it's painful. But that's like, it's, you know, we're in a debt. We have a debt to pay. And let's do that. Because if we work together, I think we can make some progress. We can change some things, you know, and we got to get there.
Yep.
So, thank you all so much. Thank you for your contributions, your thoughts, your minds, your wisdom. I love and appreciate all of you. And I hope that we have the opportunity to connect and do more and continue working on this. And, you know, I'm always open to contributing however I can. So here's to the future.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you, Frida, and also Rachel, who facilitated this talk. It's a great, you know, I hope it can just happen again and again. It's, you know, it's really a necessary thing to continue outside of the constraints of the social media kind of limited focus, you know, to really say, this is what we're going to do. We're going to talk about these things.
Yeah.
And keep talking about them, you know, forever.
And keep making plans as well. I think that's, I just want to make a point that the festival has said to us that they want to continue doing their work internally as a, you know, a festival of Black music, and look at ways that they can keep moving forward and do more work. And, you know, they have committed to that. I've been talking to other organizations that I work with that have also committed to it. And we're still trying to kind of find new structural ways to enact that change alongside the conversations. The conversations, they inform, they push, you know, and I think they're powerful in themselves, but there's also the actions. And, you know, I'm sitting here to kind of commit myself to doing things and being held accountable to that in a month, a year, 5 years. You know, I want to say it out loud and hope other people continue to do that, and we all keep pushing everyone else to do that around us as well.
Amazing.
All
Thank
right.
you so much.
Thank you.
Guys.